I am Abraham Lincoln, your 16th president of these divided states of America and your commander-in-chief in this terrible war that's been tearing our nation apart for 4 long years. When I was elected your president, in case you haven't seen the news, 4 years ago, 11 southern states decided to form their own country. They would call it the Confederate States of America. There had been rumors, rumors upon rumors, that the South would secede from the Union. And then when I was elected your president 4 years ago, the southern states said, we've had it. If Abraham Lincoln, the black Republican, many would call me, if he comes to Washington, we'll not only leave the country, and then some even said we'll assassinate him, even if he makes it through Baltimore and to the Capitol. I gave my first speech March 4th, 1861, and I want all American citizens to know that I did not want a war. I said to Mr. Jefferson Davis, who believed in slavery, the Confederacy presidency, I said, Mr. Davis, think about what you're doing. No state can leave the Union without the consensus of the other. We must remain together. This Union is perpetual. Though passions may have strained, it must not break the bonds of affection. Think about what you're doing, Mr. Davis. But Mr. Davis had his mind made up, folks. Mr. Davis, you see, just a little bit about Mr. Davis. He was born in Kentucky right down the road from me, 80 miles, 2 years before me. But his folks, when he was 3 years old in 1810, moved to Mississippi, where you can make a lot of money on a plantation with cotton. Mr. Davis owned those plantations in Mississippi. Mr. Davis made this comment about the black folks. You need to know this, folks. He said, quote, the black man will never be more than 1/10 of what he was ever meant to be, and that is of a slave, end quote. Mr. Jefferson Davis had his mind made up, and the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter, April 12th, 1861. And the war, I think I see a sign right down here that said between the states. I never said that, but that's what some said. It was a war between the states. I called it the War of Rebellion, because I believe that no state could leave the Union without the consensus of the others. Most folks in the country are calling it our American Civil War. Now, when that first shot was fired, all of you must know the decision that I made after my cabinet members, all of them with the exception of one, all of my cabinet members, Mr. Seward, Secretary of State, Salmon Chase, Secretary of Treasury, those kind of fellows, here's what they said to me. Let them go. Let the wayward sisters go. Mr. President, we'll form our own perfect union up here with 23 states left. You see, there were 34 states in our country, about half free and half slave. And I could have done that. And here's what I said to those advisors, intelligent men, if you will. But I said, this nation is worth fighting for to secure such an inestimable jewel. A portion of the people cannot destroy what the whole people created. I must keep the word united in the phrase United States. And I'm sure you remember that first battle, Battle of Bull Run, July 21st, soldiers on both sides, blue and the gray, would sign up. Everyone were going to have their glorious day. No one would get hurt. So there at Manassas, 16 to 20,000 blue and gray coats would gather around to begin the first battle of the war. I was told that picnickers from local townspeople and picnickers would come in with their lunch baskets and their parasols to enjoy this affair where there would be no blood. 900 Union and Confederate soldiers would die that first day. It would be a Confederate victory as Stonewall Jackson came out of nowhere and saved the day for the Confederates as McDowell, the Union general, he was enjoying lunch. Yes, got caught off guard, and the Union soldiers would go skedaddling back to Washington. And I would look out the White House window and I would say, gentlemen, it's going to be bad. It's going to be damn bad. I called up 75,000 volunteers, and I had a plan called the Anaconda Plan to squeeze off the Confederacy. But this war would go on and on and on. I couldn't find a general that could fight. Oh, McClellan. Perhaps you've heard of Mr. McClellan. He's got the slows. Oh, could he organize his men? But he didn't know how to fight. He was second in his graduating class. I thought he was the man. War would go on. Thousands and thousands of battles. There would be over 2,000 battles in 1861 and 1862. It looked like our nation was going to be split apart. Two separate countries, and all that the founding fathers had fought for would be for naught. But I had one answer left. I came to my cabinet members July 22nd, 1862, and I said, I'm going to free the slaves with a document called the Emancipation Proclamation. Hold it up high. My cabinet members said, you can't do this, Mr. Lincoln. You have no constitutional right to free the slaves. I was always patient with anyone's rhetoric and statements, and I said, well, perhaps you have not seen or read the Constitution. I have the Commander-in-Chief right to do what I have to do to save this nation from a foreign invasion. You see, I believe the 11 states would be considered foreign invaders, treasonous. And I'm going to free the slaves with a document called the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, I did listen to my Secretary of State, William Seward. He said, it will look like a measure in desperation. We need a victory first. So I waited for that victory. And there at Antietam, September 17th, 1862, George McClellan, really you might say the only victory he had that was worth anything, defeated Robert E. Lee there at Antietam. 22,000 casualties in one day, September 17th, 1862. But it was the Northern victory that I needed. I said the Emancipation Proclamation will go through now. And it will be effective in the year of our Lord, January 1, 1863. And this would give me 200,000 black men in blue. And I am going to show you perhaps my favorite Matthew Brady portrait. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment up in Massachusetts, where 1,000 free blacks would now begin the first regiment of U.S. colored troops. They were free. They didn't have to fight. But they were going to fight for their brethren. My cabinet members would say, you must rescind the Emancipation Proclamation. But then I heard about this 54th Massachusetts Regiment. They stormed Fort Wagner. It was a suicide mission. They knew they were going to die. Now, mind you, they were free blacks. They were not slaves. They stormed Fort Wagner, and half of 200 black soldiers put their names on the back of their uniforms, knowing they were going to die. And they were all slaughtered right there at Fort Wagner in the fall of 1863. 262 to be exact. My cabinet members tried to convince me one more time to rescind the Emancipation Proclamation. And I would say, well, apparently you didn't hear my words in the beginning, so I'll describe them to you in another form of words. This union is the world's best hope for democracy. I must save this government. You see, folks, I'm sure you've heard and read the Harper's Weekly that my paramount object in this struggle was to save the Union. If I could save the Union by freeing none of the slaves, I would do that. If I could save the Union by freeing just some of the slaves, I would do that as well. And if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do that as well. This Emancipation Proclamation has given me 200,000 black men in blue. My whole soul was in that one act. If I will ever be remembered for any one thing, it will be that one act that freed those poor folks that should never have been in bondage in the first place. But folks, I'm sure you remember from the Harper's Weekly, we were still losing. I couldn't find a general that could fight and defeat Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was on a string of victories, especially after Chancellorsville. Yes, where his right arm, Stonewall Jackson, would be accidentally shot by his own men and he would die of pneumonia. But Robert E. Lee was making his way north to kidnap me. The telegraph was telling me in the War Department, and he was coming to Washington in exchange for prisoners in a peace negotiation. But he had to come through a little town called Gettysburg. Robert E. Lee's 100,000-man army would meet my George Meade's 100,000-man army July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. If Robert E. Lee wins, folks, he's coming to get me, and we're going to be two separate nations, and slaves would go back to the way it was. Thank God Almighty, Robert E. Lee was defeated there at Gettysburg. The whole war should have ended right then and there, July 3rd. Meade let him get away, like my other 10 generals. They'd let their foes get away. So many died at Gettysburg. A National Soldier Cemetery was to be dedicated that same year, and I was asked to give a few appropriate remarks. I would be the secondary speaker that would speak behind the main speaker, the main orator of the country of the day, Edward Everett, who would speak for 2 hours. It would be a dedication to dedicate these dead a national cemetery. I accepted that offer, and I began to read with more intensity about Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. What did he mean, folks? The third line that says that all men are created equal. So there has been some dispute as to when I began to write the speech, but I'll tell you I scribbled much of it on the 4-hour train ride, 80 miles, from Washington to Gettysburg. I would be the secondary speaker.
Hold it, Clark. You okay?
Are you all right? Go sit down. Go sit down.
I would be the secondary speaker. Edward Everett would speak for 2 hours. It was cold. November, Pennsylvania, the battlefield. You'd be cold too, wouldn't you? Well, when I got up to give a few appropriate remarks, the folks didn't know it was going to be a few remarks. You should have seen the looks on their faces. Oh no, not 2 more hours. It would be 3 or 4 minutes. And here's what I said to those 15,000, to all American citizens and to all of the world. The words that I had jotted down and put together would be known as the Gettysburg Message, the Gettysburg Address. And I shall recite that speech I gave you about 18 months ago. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as the final resting place for those who gave their lives, that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow these grounds. The brave men, the living and dead, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which those who fought here have thus far nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that special cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. I got down from the platform. I went back to the executive mansion. I believe that Joe Johnston and Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and all of the Confederates, or rebels they called them, would now believe, after 400,000 dead soldiers, that we must stay together. But you see, I had not found my general who could fight. They had their mind made up. They were never going to surrender. You see, they had never met a foe like Ulysses S. Grant. I was hearing about Mr. Grant in the Western Theater. He had never lost a battle, and he knew the art of war. Find your enemy, destroy your enemy, and force him to surrender. You see, Mr. Lee had never met a foe like that. I brought him into the White House, and I said, Mr. Grant, I've been hearing and reading about your successes, and I'm going to make you the head of all Union armies. And wherever Lee goes, you go, and you hold on with a bulldog grip, and you chew and choke until he surrenders. And when he surrenders, Mr. Lee, that is, let him up easy. Huh. I had a politician come up to me not too long ago, about 3 months, and said, Mr. President, Mr. Grant is not the man. He is drinking on the job all the time. Now, folks, you know how I abhor liquor. Can't stand the stuff. You need to fire Mr. Grant. Why, he wakes up drunk, goes to bed drunk, always a-drinking. And I says, is that so? Well, here's what I want you to do, Mr. Politician. I want you to find a brand of whiskey that he drinks. And I want you to go and spread it and give it to all of his generals. He fights. I can't spare this man. You see, Robert E. Lee now has never met a foe like Ulysses S. Grant. And now I have the most glorious news to share with you. We like good news, don't we? Yes, I just received a telegraph from the War Department that Robert E. Lee is going to surrender any day now in Virginia. You see, Grant has Lee in a siege. He's starving out the town. The supplies can't come in. The folks are starving. He is going to be forced to surrender. And when that happens, we will be one nation, as our founding fathers always meant for it to be. Now that victory is coming soon, but let me give you the latest count. 620,000 Union and Confederate soldiers would give their lives for all of you sitting right there, so our nation could be whole. The other bit of good news I have, I'd be remiss if I didn't give you the other bit of good news. I just got the Emancipation Proclamation passed January 31st. 3 months ago, 1865. It has now become the 13th Amendment. I'm sure you folks know about those first 10 amendments. The Bill of Rights can never be changed. You see, if I don't use all of my favors and get that 13th Amendment passed, my second term will end in 3 years, and another president might come in and say, we think slavery's a good thing. We think slavery should be able to go out west. And the whole slavery matter would not be resolved. I used every favor I could to get that Emancipation Proclamation passed. I had no chance. My wife said, January 4th, 1865. She said, why, Mr. Lincoln, she called me, why would you use all of your favors on something you know you can't get passed? Why, you need 20 from the other side, the Democrats. And I said, I like my chances. You might say I used a little bit of political savvy to get that Emancipation Proclamation passed as the 13th Amendment. Well, I'm going to go back to Washington now to get more good battlefront news from Grant. And the war is going to be over. But before I go back to Washington, are there any questions